The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge when Sarah Beth McKinnon stepped down from the stagecoach, her small hand clutching a worn patchwork blanket. At 6 years old, she possessed the kind of fierce determination that would have made her late mother proud and worried her father sick if he'd known what she was about to do. The frontier town buzzed with the usual activity. It's of 1867. Cowboys heading out to distant ranches, merchants hawking their wares, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic hammering of the blacksmith. But Sarah Beth's attention was fixed on something else entirely, a small cluster of teepees beyond the town's edge, where smoke curled lazily into the crisp autumn air. Her father, Thomas McKinnon, was deep in conversation with the bank president about expanding his cattle operation. Sarah Beth had heard the grown-ups talking and hushed. Tones about the Indian problem and how the Lakota tribe had been forced to make camp near town after losing their hunting grounds. She'd also heard her father's foreman, Jake Morrison, speaking with unusual gentleness about a Lakota woman and her sick baby who'd been coming to the edge of town, hoping for help that rarely came. What the adults didn't know was that Sarah Beth had been watching. She'd seen the young mother, barely more than a girl herself, walking the perimeter of town with a bundle pressed close to her chest. She'd witnessed the way people turned away, the way shop doors closed a little too quickly. But most of all, she'd noticed how thin the woman looked, and how the baby's cries seemed to grow weaker each day. The blanket in Sarah Beth's hands had been her most treasured possession, sewn by her mother before consumption took her the previous winter. Each patch told a story. The blue calico from her mother's wedding dress, the green gingham from Sarah Beth's first school frock, the red flannel from Christmas stockings that would never be filled again. It was all she had left of the woman who used to sing her to sleep and brush her golden hair each morning. But as Sarah Beth slipped away from the adults and walked toward the Lakota camp, the blanket felt less like a possession and more like a bridge. The young mother sat outside the largest teepee, rocking a bundle that made no sound. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her language, though she felt anything but eternal in that moment. At 19, she had already lost her husband to a cavalry raid, and now watched helplessly as her infant son grew sicker. Each day, the baby, whom she'd named Chatten, meaning falcon, had been born healthy. But the harsh conditions of displacement and the early onset of winter had taken their toll. When the small white girl approached, Ayanna's first instinct was to retreat. She'd learned to expect stones, harsh words, or worse from the townspeople. But something in the child's earnest blue eyes made her pause. Sarah Beth held out the blanket without a word. Ayanna stared at it, then at the girl, understanding passing. Between them, like a whispered prayer. The blanket was beautiful, clearly precious, and warmer than anything Ayanna had been able to provide for her son. For the baby, Sarah Beth said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna's throat tightened. She wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. But Chatan chose that moment to shiver in her arms, and motherhood conquered pride. With trembling hands, she accepted the blanket and immediately wrapped it around her son. For the first time in days, the baby's breathing seemed to ease. "Thank you, Ayanna," whispered in English. The words feeling strange on her tongue, Sarah Beth smiled the first genuine smile she'd given since her mother died and turned to walk back toward town. She didn't see the tears streaming down Ayanna's face, or the way the other Lakota women emerged from their teepees to witness what had just occurred. She couldn't have known that this single act of kindness would ripple through both communities. It's like a stone thrown into still water. But someone else had been watching. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of town, his weathered hands gripping his hat brim as he observed the exchange. At 28, Jake had seen enough of the frontier to be hardened by it. But something about the scene before him cracked open a part of his heart he'd thought sealed forever. He'd lost his own family, wife and daughter, to cholera 3 years prior. And since then, he'd moved through life like a man walking underwater, going through the motions, but never quite surfacing. Seeing the little McKinnon girl give away what was clearly her most precious possession to help a stranger's child stirred something in him that felt dangerously close to hope. Jake had noticed Ayanna before. It would have been impossible not to. She possessed a quiet beauty that transcended the harsh circumstances of her situation. Her long black hair caught the light like silk, and her dark eyes held a depth of sorrow he recognized in his own mirror. Each morning, but more than her beauty, it was her dignity that drew him. Despite having lost everything, she carried herself with a grace that put most of the proper ladies in town to shame. As Sarah Beth walked back toward the main street, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He approached Ayanna slowly, careful not to startle her. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat entirely. "I'm Jake Morrison. I work for Mr. McKinnon, that little girl's father." Ayanna clutched the blanket-trapped Caton closer to her chest, wariness replacing the brief softness that had crossed her features during her encounter with Sarah Beth. "Your daughter has a good heart," she said carefully. "She's not my daughter, ma'am. Though I wish I could claim credit for raising such a fine child. That would be Mr. McKinnon's doing, and her late mother's influence, I reckon." Jake cleared his throat. "I came over because... Well, because I wanted you to know that not everyone in town feels the way some do." Ayanna studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. There was something about this man, something in the way he looked at her son without fear or disgust, something in the gentleness of his voice that made her defenses waver slightly. "Your baby," Jake continued, glancing at the small bundle. "He needs more than a blanket, doesn't he?" The question hung in the air between them. Ayanna's jaw tightened, pride warring with desperation. "He needs many things we cannot provide," Jake nodded slowly. "What if I told you there might be a way to help? Not charity," he added quickly. Seeing her eyes flash, "Work. Honest work. With fair pay and a warm place to stay while your boy gets better." "What kind of work?" Ayanna's voice was barely audible. "Mr. McKinnon's been looking for someone to help with Sarah Beth, the child's. Ben. Well, she's been struggling since her mother passed. Barely eats, hardly speaks, except when spoken to. She needs someone who understands loss, someone with a gentle hand." Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. "Today's the first time I've seen her smile in months." Ayanna looked down at Chaitan, who seemed to be breathing easier, wrapped in Sarah Beth's blanket. The proposition was impossible, of course. No white family would willingly take in a Lakota woman and her child, regardless of need. But something in Jake Morrison's eyes suggested he might be different from other white men she'd encountered. "And you think Mr. McKinnon would agree to this?" she asked. "I think Mr. McKinnon is a good man who's watched his daughter fade away a little more each day. It's good. I think he'd consider anything that might bring her back to the world of the living." Jake's voice grew softer. "I think Sarah Beth just showed us all something about the power of kindness." Before Ayanna could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A group of men rode into view, led by Sheriff Coleman, a man whose reputation for dealing harshly with the local tribes was well known. Behind him rode several of the town's more prominent citizens, including Reverend Hayes and the banker, Mr. Whitmore. "Morrison," Sheriff Coleman called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "What are you doing consorting with these people?" "Oh." Jake straightened, his jaw setting in a hard line. "Having a conversation, Sheriff. Last I checked, that wasn't against." "The law might want to be more careful about the company you keep," the sheriff said, dismounting. "Some folks in town are getting nervous about having these Indians so close, starting to wonder if it might be time to move them along." Ayanna began to retreat toward her teepee, but Jake's voice stopped her. "These people have done nothing wrong, Sheriff. In fact, they've shown more decency than some I could mention."
Yes.
"A dangerous attitude, Morrison. You might want to remember which side you're on." The tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Jake felt his hand drift instinctively toward the gun at his hip. But before the situation could escalate further, a clear voice cut through the standoff. "Sheriff Coleman. What seems to be the trouble here?" Thomas McKinnon strode across the open ground, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 42, he was a man who'd built his reputation on fairness and quiet strength. His success as a rancher had earned him respect throughout the territory, and his word carried weight even with men like Coleman. "Mr. McKinnon, the sheriff," said his tone shifting to something more respectful. "I was just having a word with your foreman here about the wisdom of getting too friendly with the hostiles. Hostiles. Thomas looked around the peaceful camp, taking in the cooking fires, the children playing quietly, the women tending to daily tasks. I don't see any hostiles, Sheriff. I see families trying to survive a difficult situation. With respect, sir, these people don't belong here. They're making some folks nervous. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the sheriff to Jake to Ayanna, who still clutched the bundled baby. Something flickered in his expression as he noticed the blanket, his late wife's blanket, the one Sarah Beth treasured above all else. "Where did you get that blanket?" asked Ayanna gently. Ayanna's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been discovered, and now this man would surely demand the return of what was obviously a precious family heirloom. But when she looked into Thomas McKinnon's eyes, she saw not anger, but curiosity tinged with something that might have been wonder. "Your daughter," she said quietly. "She gave it to my son." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then at the bundle in her arms. "May I asked, gesturing toward the baby. Ayanna hesitated, then slowly pulled back the blanket's edge to reveal Chatton's small face. The baby was thin, clearly unwell, but his dark eyes were alert and intelligent. Thomas looked at his daughter's blanket wrapped around this stranger's child, and something shifted inside him. A wall he'd built around his heart after his wife's death began to crack. He thought of Sarah Beth, so withdrawn since her mother's passing, and of the conversation he'd had with Jake just that morning about finding someone to help care for the child. "Sheriff," Thomas said without taking his eyes off the baby, "these people are under my protection now, sir. You heard me. This woman and her child are going to be staying at my ranch, helping to care for my daughter. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The sheriff's face flushed red. "Mr. McKinnon, you can't be serious. The townspeople won't stand for. The townspeople don't have a say in who I employ or how I run my ranch. And neither do you, Sheriff." Jake felt his heart swell with admiration for his employer, but he also recognized the dangerous ground they were all walking on. Taking in a Lakota woman and her child wouldn't just raise eyebrows, it could make enemies of some very powerful people. As if reading his thoughts, Thomas continued, "Jake, would you escort Miss... ... He paused, realizing he didn't know Ayanna's name. "Ayanna," she said softly. Ayanna, Standing Bear. "Would you escort Miss Standing Bear and her son to the ranch? I believe my daughter is waiting there, and I have a feeling these two have more to offer each other than any of us realize." Sheriff Coleman remounted his horse with obvious anger. "This is a mistake, McKinnon. Mark my words, no good will come of this." As the sheriff and his men rode away, Thomas turned back to Ayanna. "I hope you'll forgive the presumption, Miss Standing Bear. I should have asked before making such an announcement. But when I saw my late wife's blanket wrapped around your son, I felt... ... Well, I felt like maybe it was meant to be." Ayanna looked between Thomas and Jake, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "You would trust your daughter to a stranger? To someone your people consider an enemy?" "My daughter chose to trust you first," Thomas said simply, "and her judgment has always been better than mine. Besides," he added with the ghost of a smile,
"A woman who can inspire such generosity in my stubborn little girl is someone I'd like to know better."
The ride to the McKinnon Ranch took less than an hour, but for Ayanna, it felt like traveling between two different worlds. She rode alongside Jake on a gentle mare he'd saddled for her, Chatan secure in her arms, still wrapped in Sarah Beth's precious blanket. Jake had fashioned a makeshift sling to help her carry the baby, his hands gentle and careful as he adjusted the straps. "You don't have to do this," Ayanna said as they rode. "What your boss did back there, it was kind, but it will cause problems. For all of you." Jake was quiet for a moment, watching the familiar landscape roll past. "His Standing Bear can... I ask you something, Ayanna. Please, Ayanna." He seemed to taste the name, and she felt something flutter in her chest at the way it sounded in his voice. "When you lost your husband, did you think you'd ever feel anything again? Besides the hurt, I mean." The question caught her off guard. She studied his profile as he rode beside her, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins a little too tightly. "For a long time, no," she admitted. "I thought the sadness would be all that was left of me, but But then, Chayton was born, and I realized that love doesn't die just because the person you loved is gone. It changes, grows into something different, something that includes the memory of what was, but isn't trapped by it. Jake nodded slowly. I lost my family 3 years ago. Wife and daughter, both taken by cholera in the same week. I thought I was done with caring about anything, and now, turned to look at her then, and Ayanna felt her breath catch. There was something raw and honest in his gaze, something that made her pulse quicken despite all her attempts to guard. Her heart. I'm starting to think maybe there's still some life left in me after all. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, but Ayanna was acutely aware of Jake's presence beside her. There was strength in him, but also gentleness. She'd seen it in the way he'd helped her mount the horse, in the careful way he'd adjusted the baby carrier, in the tone of his voice when he spoke to Chatan. The McKinnon ranch sprawled across a wide valley, with the main house sitting on a slight rise overlooking cattle-dotted pastures. It was larger than Ayanna had expected, built of solid timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows as evening approached. Sarah Beth was waiting on the porch, practically vibrating with excitement. The moment they rode into the yard, she ran down the steps, her blonde hair streaming behind her. Did you bring them, Jake? Did you bring the lady and her baby? Jake dismounted and helped Ayanna down, careful not to jostle Chatan. I did indeed. Little miss, this is Miss Ayanna and her son Chayton. Sarah Beth approached shyly, her earlier boldness giving way to sudden uncertainty. Is he feeling better? The baby? Ayanna knelt down so she was at Sarah Beth's eye level. He is much better, thanks to your blanket. It was the kindest gift anyone has ever given us. Mama made it, Sarah Beth said softly. Before she went to heaven. But I think she would want the baby to have it. Tears pricked at Ayanna's eyes. This child, this beautiful, generous child, was offering not just material comfort, but emotional healing to a stranger. It was a kind of grace Ayanna hadn't expected to find in this harsh world. Would you like to see him? Ayanna asked Sarah. Beth nodded eagerly. Ayanna carefully pulled back the blanket to reveal Chayton's face.
The baby was awake.
His dark eyes curious as he took in his new surroundings. He's so little, Sarah Beth whispered in wonder. Can I touch his hand? Very gently. Sarah Beth reached out with one small finger and stroked Chayton's tiny fist. The baby's fingers immediately curled around hers, and Sarah Beth's face lit up with the kind of joy Ayanna suspected had been absent for far too long. He likes me. Knows you're the one who helped him, Ayanna said. Babies are very smart about things like that. Thomas emerged from the house, having ridden hard to arrive before them. He stopped on the porch, taking in the scene before him, his daughter, more animated than she'd been in months, fussing over a Lakota baby, while the child's mother looked on with gentle patience. Papa, Sarah Beth called out. Come see, Chayton likes me. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the moment. As he drew closer, he found himself studying Ayanna more carefully. She was younger than he'd first thought. Probably no. More than 19 or 20. But there was a maturity in her bearing that spoke of hardships faced and overcome. Her dark hair was braided with small beads that caught the lamplight, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held a combination of wariness and hope that made his chest tighten. Miss Standing Bear, he said formally. Welcome to our home. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. McKinnon. I know this cannot be easy for you. Thomas, he said. Please. And it's not as difficult as you might think. My daughter hasn't shown this much interest in anything since her mother passed. If you and your son can bring some joy back into her life, then we're the ones who should be grateful. Jake had been watching the exchange with growing admiration for his employer and growing attraction to the woman beside him. There was something about Ayanna that drew him like a moth to flame, not just her beauty, though she was certainly that, but her strength. Her dignity in the face of adversity, the gentle way she interacted with Sarah Beth. We should get you both settled, Jake said. It's getting cold, and the little one needs somewhere warm to sleep. Thomas nodded. I've had Mrs. Patterson prepare the small cabin behind the main house. It's got a good stove and plenty of room for both of you. And Ayanna? He paused. I meant what I said earlier. You're not charity cases here. You'll earn your keep, and you'll be treated with the respect due any member of this household." As they moved toward the cabin, Ayanna felt a strange mixture of hope and fear settling in her chest. Hope because, for the first time since her husband's death, she could envision a future that held more than mere survival. Fear because she was beginning to care about these people, the grieving widower, the lonely child, and especially the gentle foreman whose eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. The cabin was indeed comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and a smaller room with 2 beds. Someone, Mrs. Patterson, presumably had laid a fire in the stove and left a pot of stew warming on top. Fresh bread sat wrapped in cloth on the table, along with milk and butter and honey. "It's too much," Ayanna said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a start," Thomas replied. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about your duties with Sarah Beth, but tonight, just rest. Both of you." After Thomas left, Jake lingered in the doorway. "If you need anything at all, my quarters are in the bunkhouse, just across the yard. Don't hesitate to come find me." Ayanna nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, that made her heart race in a way she'd thought she'd never experience again. That night, she settled Chatan in his bed, the first real bed he'd ever slept in. Ayanna allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Sarah Beth's gift had been more than just a blanket. Maybe it had been the first thread in weaving a new kind of family, a new kind of life. But outside in the darkness, unseen eyes watched the cabin windows, and Sheriff Coleman's warning echoed in the wind. No good will come of this. The next. A few weeks passed in a blur of routine and small revelations. Ayanna settled into her role as Sarah Beth's caretaker with surprising ease, discovering that the lonely little girl was hungry for the kind of gentle attention she provided. They spent their days together exploring the ranch, tending to small chores, and slowly building a bond that transcended the differences in their backgrounds. Sarah Beth taught Ayanna English words she didn't know, while Ayanna shared stories from her own childhood, tales of brave warriors and clever animals that made the little girl's eyes shine with wonder. Most importantly, Sarah Beth helped care for Chatan, stinging to him in her sweet voice and helping Ayanna with feeding and bathing duties, under the influence of good food, warmth, and medical attention from the town doctor, whom Thomas had summoned despite potential gossip. Chatan began to thrive. His cheeks filled out, his eyes grew brighter, and he started to make the gurgling sounds that meant he was content. Jake found himself making excuses to check on them throughout each day. Officially, he was ensuring that Ayanna had everything she needed to care for Sarah Beth. Unofficially, he was drawn to the cabin like iron filings to a magnet. There was something about watching Ayanna with the children that made him ache with longing for the family he'd lost and the possibility of finding love again. Their conversations grew longer and more personal with each passing day. Ayanna told him about her life before the displacement. It's about her marriage to a young warrior named Dakota who died defending their people's right to remain on ancestral lands. Jake shared memories of his wife, Mary, and their daughter, Emma, painting pictures of quiet happiness that had been stolen too soon. "Do you think it's possible to love someone new without betraying the memory of who came before?" Jake asked one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching Sarah Beth and Chatan play on a blanket spread on the grass. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "In my culture, we believe that love is like a river. It doesn't stop flowing just because it encounters rocks or changes direction. It finds new channels, new ways to move forward. But the water itself remains pure. That's a beautiful way to think about it. My grandmother used to say that the spirits of those we've loved want us to be happy, that honoring their memory doesn't mean stopping our hearts from beating." Jake turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Ayanna, Jake, Ayanna." Sarah Beth's voice interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. "Come quick." Chatan's trying to sit up. They hurried over to where the baby was indeed making valiant attempts to push himself up from his stomach. His little face screwed up with determination. It was a milestone that brought tears to Ayanna's eyes and laughter from Sarah Beth. "He's getting so strong," Sarah Beth said proudly, as if she'd personally been responsible for Chatan's improvement. "He is," Ayanna agreed, lifting her son and settling him against her shoulder. Thanks to all of you. As autumn deepened into winter, the small family unit they'd formed grew stronger. Thomas often joined them for dinner, finding that Ayana's presence brought a warmth to the house that had been missing since his wife's death. She was an excellent cook, preparing meals that combined traditional Lakota techniques with ingredients from the ranch's well-stocked pantry. More importantly, she understood grief in a way that allowed her to help both Thomas and Sarah Beth navigate their own loss. She never tried to replace the memory of Sarah Beth's mother, but instead helped the child celebrate that memory while also embracing new experiences. But their peace was not to last. Uninterrupted, the trouble started small whispered conversations that stopped when Jake entered the mercantile, cold stares when Thomas conducted business in town, pointed questions about the Indian woman he was harboring. Sheriff Coleman made several visits to the ranch, ostensibly checking on their welfare, but really looking for any excuse to cause problems. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when Ayana ventured into town with Sarah Beth to purchase supplies for Christmas dinner. They'd planned to buy ingredients for traditional holiday treats. Sarah Beth excited to share her family's recipes while learning about Ayana's own cultural celebrations. They'd barely stepped inside the general store when the whispers started. That's her the squaw McKinnon's taken in. Shameful, I tell you. What's next? Inviting the whole tribe to Christmas dinner? Poor little Sarah Beth, being raised by a savage. Sarah Beth's hand tightened in Ayana's, and the little girl lifted her chin defiantly. Ayana's not a savage. She's the kindest person I know, and she makes the best cornbread in the whole territory. The store fell silent. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, flushed red with embarrassment, while several other women looked away uncomfortably. But Reverend Hayes, who'd been examining bolts of cloth near the back of the store, stepped forward with a stern expression. Sarah Beth McKinnon, you should not be defending heathens. It's not Christian. Then I don't want to be Christian, Sarah Beth declared, her voice carrying clearly through the store. If being Christian means being mean to people who help sick babies and make me laugh when I'm sad, then I'd rather be whatever Ayana is. The gasps that followed this pronouncement were audible. Ayana knelt down beside Sarah Beth, her heart breaking for the child who was being forced to choose between her newfound happiness and social acceptance. Sarah Beth, she said quietly, we should go home now. The little girl's eyes filled with tears. They're being mean to you, and it's not fair. You're the best person I know, and they're stupid for not seeing it. Before Ayana could respond, the store door chimed and Jake entered, immediately taking in the tense atmosphere and Sarah Beth's tear-streaked face. Is there a problem here? His voice was dangerously quiet. Reverend Hayes drew himself up to his full height. Shh. Mr. Morrison, this child is being raised with heathen influences. Someone needs to speak to her father about the corrupting presence in his household. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Ayana caught his eye and shook her head slightly. Violence would only make things worse for all of them. The only corruption I see here, Reverend, is the kind that makes grown adults cruel to children and strangers in need, Jake said evenly. Now, I suggest you step aside so Miss Standing Bear and Sarah Beth can make their purchases in peace. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. For a moment, it seemed like the confrontation might escalate. But then Mrs. Henderson stepped forward nervously. Of course, Mr. Morrison. What can I get for you folks today? They completed their shopping in uncomfortable silence, with Jake's presence serving as a protective buffer between Ayana and the hostile stares of the other customers. But as they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Ayana knew that something fundamental had shifted. Sorry, she said quietly, as Jake helped her up onto the wagon seat. For what? For causing problems. For putting Sarah Beth in a position where she has to defend me, for making your life more complicated. Jake was quiet for a long moment as he guided the horses out of town. Finally he said, Ayana, look at me. She turned to meet his gaze, surprised by the intensity she saw there. You haven't caused any problems. Problems were already here. The hatred, the ignorance, the fear of anything different. All you've done is show people what they're really like underneath all their Sunday manners and Christian charity. But Sarah Beth is learning what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Mother would have been proud to teach her. His voice grew softer. You're not the problem, Ayanna. You're the solution. You're healing that little girl's heart, and you're healing mine too. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning and possibility. Ayanna felt her heart skip a beat as she recognized the emotion in Jake's eyes, the same tender, desperate longing she'd been trying to ignore in herself. But before either of them could say more, they crested the hill that overlooked the McKinnon ranch, and Ayanna gasped in horror. Smoke was rising from the direction of their cabin. Jake whipped the horses into a gallop, covering the remaining distance in record time. As they approached the ranch buildings, they could see that the cabin was indeed on fire, flames licking at the walls and roof, while thick smoke poured from the windows. Thomas was already there with several ranch hands, forming a bucket brigade from the well to the burning building. But it was clear that the fire had too much of a head start. The cabin would be a total loss. Sarah Beth, Ayanna cried, leaping from the wagon before it had fully stopped. Where's Chayton? Where's my baby? Thomas turned at the sound of her voice, his face grim. They're safe. Mrs. Patterson has them at the main house, but Ayanna. He paused, his expression growing darker. This wasn't an accident. Jake had reached them by then, his face hard with anger. What do you mean? I mean, someone poured coal oil around the base of the walls before setting it ablaze. And I mean, they left this nailed to the porch post. Thomas held up a piece of paper with crude lettering that made Ayanna's blood run cold. Get out, or next time my tea won't be empty. Sarah Beth came running from the main house, Chayton in her arms, her face streaked with tears. Ayanna, are you all right? I was so scared when I saw the fire. Ayanna took her baby from Sarah Beth's trembling hands, holding him close while her mind raced. Someone had deliberately targeted her home, had threatened the safety of the children she'd come to love as her own. The message was clear. She wasn't wanted here, and her presence was putting others in danger. I have to go, she said quietly. What? Jake stepped closer, his voice fierce. No, absolutely not. Jake's right, Thomas said firmly.
Now.
We don't give in to bullies and cowards who sneak around setting fires in the night. Don't you see? Ayanna's voice broke with anguish. This is exactly what Sheriff Coleman warned you about. My being here is putting all of you at risk. What if next time they target the main house? What if Sarah Beth gets hurt because of me? That's not going to happen, Jake said, his jaw set with determination. I won't let it. You can't be everywhere. At once, Ayanna replied, I can't live with the knowledge that my presence might bring harm to these children. Sarah Beth, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, suddenly threw her arms around Ayanna's waist. Please don't go, please. I need you. And Chayton needs you. And Papa needs you. And Jake needs you too, even if he's too stubborn to say so. The child's desperate plea nearly broke Ayanna's resolve, but the charred remains of the cabin served as a stark reminder of the hatred they were facing. I love you too, little one, Ayanna whispered, stroking Sarah Beth's hair. Then you'll ever know. But sometimes loving someone means protecting them, even if it breaks your heart. She gently disentangled herself from Sarah Beth's embrace and turned to face Jake. The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. This isn't over, he said roughly. I won't let you disappear into the wilderness with a baby. Not when. Winter's coming hard? Then what do you suggest? Ayanna asked. Because I won't stay here and watch you all become targets because of me. Thomas, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly straightened as if struck by an idea. There might be another way. Everyone turned to look at him. The Hendersons have a ranch about 50 miles north of here, closer to the territorial border. Bill Henderson is a good man, and his wife's been struggling since their daughter moved east. They could use help with their household, and they're far enough from town that the local politics wouldn't matter as much. Jake's face darkened. You want to send her away? I want to keep her safe, Thomas replied. And I want to buy us time to deal with whoever's behind this. Sheriff Coleman might be unsympathetic, but there are other authorities we can appeal to. What happened here tonight was arson, pure and simple. Kayana looked between the two men. Seeing the genuine concern in both their faces, the practical part of her mind recognized the wisdom in Thomas's suggestion. It would remove her from immediate danger while still allowing her to support herself in Chayton. But her heart rebelled against the idea of leaving, of abandoning the first real home she'd found since her husband's death. "How long?" she asked quietly. "However long it takes," Jake said before Thomas could answer. "However long it takes to make this place safe for you again." The promise in his voice made her chest tight with emotion. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could conquer the hatred they faced. But she'd learned that wanting something didn't make it true. "I need time to think," she said finally, "and to pack what's left of our belongings." As it turned out, very little had survived the fire. Most of their clothes were gone, along with the few personal items Ayanna had managed to save from her previous life. But Sarah Beth's blanket, the precious patchwork quilt that had started, everything had been safely stored in the main house, where Ayanna had taken it that morning to mend a small tear. That night, they all gathered in Thomas's sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, while they tried to make sense of what had happened. Ayanna sat in a rocking chair with Chatton at her breast, the familiar motion soothing both of them. Sarah Beth curled up on the floor nearby, her head resting against Ayanna's knee as she struggled to stay awake. Jake paced the room like a caged wolf, his anger barely contained. "We should be going after whoever did this, not planning to send you away." "And how would we do that?" Thomas asked reasonably. "We don't know who's responsible, beyond the fact that it's someone with access to coal oil and matches. That could be half the men in the county. It's someone who knew we'd gone to town today," Jake pointed out. "Someone who knew the cabin would be empty." Ayanna shivered at the implication. It meant their attacker had been watching them, studying their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "All the more reason for me to leave," she said softly. "If someone is watching that closely, then staying here puts everyone at risk." Sarah Beth lifted her head, her blue eyes swimming with tears. "But what if you don't come back? What if you forget about us?" Ayanna's heart clenched. She reached down to stroke the child's golden hair, so like her mother's in the lamplight. "Could never forget about you, sweet girl. You saved my son's life with your kindness. You saved my life too, in a way I'm not sure you understand yet. Then why do you have to go?" It was Jake who answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something you love to keep. It's safe." He was looking directly at Ayanna as he spoke, and she felt the weight of his words settle over her like a mantle. Despite his anger and frustration, he understood why she felt she had no choice. Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll ride over to the Henderson place tomorrow and speak with Bill, if he's agreeable. We can have you settled there by the end of the week." "And then what?" Sarah Beth asked. "How long before Ayanna can come home?" The word home hung in the air, weighted with longing and loss. Thomas looked at Jake, who had stopped pacing and was staring out the window into the darkness. "I don't know, sweetheart," Thomas admitted. "But I promise you this, we won't stop working to make it happen." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with the promise of snow and the heavy clouds overhead. Ayanna woke early, having slept fitfully on the couch in Thomas's sitting room. Chatan had been restless too, picking up on his mother's emotional turmoil despite her attempts to remain calm. She found Jake on the front porch, cup of coffee steaming in his hands as he stared out at the charred remains of the cabin. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she was struck by how haggard he looked. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually neat hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Keep thinking I should have seen this coming," he said. "Should have been more careful, more prepared." Ayanna moved to stand beside him, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill. "This isn't your fault, Jake. It's not anyone's fault except the person who lit that match." "Isn't it?" His voice was bitter. "I knew there was talk in town, knew some people were unhappy about you being here. But I was so focused on my own feelings, on what I wanted, that I didn't take the threat seriously enough. And what is it that you want?" The question slipped out before Ayanna could stop it. But now that it was spoken, she found she desperately needed to know the answer. Jake set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. In the pale morning light, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, dark and turbulent with emotion. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not because of Sarah Beth, not because Thomas needs help with the household, but because I can't imagine going back to the empty life I was living before you came here." Ayana's breath caught. She'd suspected, hoped even, but hearing the words spoken aloud made her pulse race. Jake, ... "I know it's selfish," he continued, stepping closer. "I know you've got every reason to want nothing to do with a man who couldn't protect you from this. But Ayana, He paused, swallowing hard. "I love you. I love the way you sing to Chetan when you think no one's listening. I love how you've brought joy back into Sarah Beth's eyes. I love your strength and your gentleness, and the way you make me believe in second chances." Tears spilled down Ayana's cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "That's why this is so hard. That's why I have to go." "No." Jake reached out to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Love doesn't mean running away. It means fighting for what matters. And what if someone gets hurt while we're fighting?"
What if Sarah Beth Jake silenced her with a kiss, soft and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't yet spoken? For a moment, Ayana allowed herself to melt into him, to imagine a world where love could conquer fear and hatred and the
harsh realities of frontier life. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Jake said suddenly. Ayana stared at him in shock. "What? Marry me today, if possible?" "Thomas can perform the ceremony. He's a justice of the peace." "For the county, Jake, that's impossible. Even if the law allowed it, the law does allow it." I checked. "And before you say anything about what people will think, remember that they already think the worst of both of us. At least this way, you'd have legal protection. You'd be my wife, with all the rights that entails." Ayana's mind reeled. Marriage. Two, Jake would indeed provide legal protection that she didn't currently possess. As his wife, she would have standing in the community, however tenuous. And more than that, she loved him. Despite all the obstacles, despite the danger, despite the impossibility of their situation, she loved him with a fierce intensity that both terrified and exhilarated her, but there were still practical considerations. What? About Sarah Beth? She's already faced enough criticism for defending me. Having her father's foreman married to a Lakota woman would show her that love is stronger than prejudice. Aunt Thomas's voice interrupted from the doorway. They turned to find him standing there, fully dressed, despite the early hour, with the expression that was equal parts amused and determined. "Thomas," Jake began, "I didn't mean for you to overhear. Lucky for you that I did." Thomas stepped onto the porch, closing the door quietly behind him, because Jake's right. Marriage would provide Ayana with legal protections she doesn't currently have, and it would send a clear message to anyone who thinks they can terrorize members of my household with impunity. Ayana looked between the two men, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would really do this, knowing what it might cost you?" "My dear," Thomas said gently, "I've been watching the two of you dance around your feelings for weeks. If last night's events have taught us anything, it's that life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on fear." "But the Hendersons can wait another day or two," Thomas finished. "Besides, I have a feeling that once certain people in town learn that you're legally married to one of my most trusted employees, their enthusiasm for harassment might diminish somewhat." Jake reached for Ayana's hands, his eyes never leaving her face. "What do you say? Will you take a chance on a broken-down cowboy who loves you more than his next breath?" Ayana looked at this man who had shown her kindness when the world seemed determined to offer only cruelty. She thought of Sarah Beth, who had shared her most precious possession with a stranger's child. She thought of Thomas, who had opened his home to people he barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. And she thought of Chetan, growing stronger every day in the warmth and security of this makeshift family. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jake's whoop of joy woke half the household. But no one complained when they learned the reason. Mrs. Patterson immediately began planning a wedding feast. while Sarah Beth appointed herself in charge of decorating the sitting room with whatever flowers she could find in the winter-dormant garden. By late afternoon, they had assembled a small but meaningful gathering. Dr. Henley had ridden out from town, partly to check on Chayton's continued recovery, partly because he was one of the few townspeople who had consistently treated Sayana with respect. Mrs. Patterson served as matron of honor, while Sarah Beth insisted on being the flower girl. Despite the fact that her flowers were actually colorful leaves she'd gathered from the few remaining oak trees. Ayana wore a dress that had belonged to Thomas's late wife, a simple but elegant creation of deep blue wool that complemented her dark hair and eyes. Sarah Beth had braided wildflowers into her hair, creating a crown that was both beautiful and symbolic of the bridge she was building between two cultures. Jake had managed to find a clean shirt and his best boots, though his hands shook slightly. As he helped Thomas arrange chairs in the sitting room, the reality of what they were doing, the magnitude of the step they were taking, was beginning to sink in. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly as they waited for the women to finish their preparations. "Surer than I've ever been about anything," Jake replied without hesitation. "I just hope I can be the husband she deserves. Love and respect, Jake. That's all any woman really wants. That and a man who'll stand up for her when the world gets ugly. On that score, she never have cause to complain." Ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Thomas read from both the Bible and a book of Lakota poetry that Ayana had somehow salvaged from her previous life, creating a service that honored both their traditions. When Jake slipped a ring his grandmother's wedding band hastily resized by the ranch's blacksmith onto Ayana's finger, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "You may kiss your bride," Thomas announced with a broad smile. Jake needed no further encouragement. He gathered Ayana into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of promises and hope and all the tomorrows they would face together. "Love you, Mrs. Morrison," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you, husband," she whispered back. Sarah Beth cheered and clapped, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Does this mean Ayana is my mama now?" The question hung in the air for a moment, waited with hope and possibility. Ayana knelt down to Sarah Beth's level, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I could never replace your mama, sweet girl. But if you'd like, I could be your other mama. What of one who helps take care of you and loves you and teaches you things your first mama would want you to know?" Sarah Beth considered this seriously for a moment, then threw her arms around Ayana's neck. "I would like that very much," she said solemnly. "And Chatton can be my little brother, right?" "Right," Ayana agreed, her voice thick with emotion. As the evening wore on, celebrated with Mrs. Patterson's excellent cooking and music, provided by Jake's surprisingly skilled harmonica playing, Dr. Henley regaled them with stories from his medical practice, while Thomas shared memories of his late wife that were both poignant and celebratory. But as the hour grew late and their guests began to depart, the reality of their situation reasserted itself. They were married now, legally bound together. But the hatred that had driven someone to burn down their home hadn't disappeared with the exchange of vows. "What happens now?" Yana asked, as she and Jake stood together on the porch watching Dr. Henley's buggy disappear into the darkness. "Now we take it one day at a time," Jake replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "And we trust that love is stronger than fear." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Jake immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but Thomas's voice from behind them was calm. "It's all right. I've been expecting them." 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Ayana gasped as she recognized the lead figure. It was Tall Bear, an elder from her own tribe, accompanied by 2 younger warriors. "Grandfather," she said in Lakota, using the respectful term for an elder rather than indicating actual family relationship. Ayana standing bare, he replied in the same language. "We heard about the fire. We came to see if you were safe." Jake stepped protectively closer to Ayana, not understanding the words but recognizing the solemnity of the moment. "I am safe," Ayana assured the elder. "These people have shown me great kindness." Tall Bear's keen eyes took in Jake's protective stance, the wedding dress Ayana still wore, and the obvious bond between them. "You have married this man?" I have, and he treats you well. Your son is healthy and happy. Yes, grandfather, very much so. Tall Bear dismounted and approached them slowly, his weathered face serious but not unkind. When he reached Jake, he stopped and studied him for a long moment. You, he said in heavily accented English. You love my granddaughter? Jake straightened, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Yes, sir. With all my heart. You protect her, her child? With my life? Tall Bear nodded slowly, then reached into a leather pouch at his side. He withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin and handed it to Ayanna. From your grandmother, he said, switching back to Lakota. She said you would know.